podcast.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Mackey from the Thompson Foundation. I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online for this discussion around digital resilience for journalists in a year of elections. More than 60 countries are going to the polls this year. That's over 2 billion people who will be or who already have cast their vote. 2024 started off with elections in Taiwan, and we commissioned research specifically on AI disinformation attacks during those elections, and it found a growing sophistication in the use of AI, and the report calls for innovative solutions to stop the spread of false information. So that's the background to what we're going to be talking about today, how journalists can not only build digital resilience, but also expose and hopefully stop the spread of false information before and, of course, during elections. And as part of that, we'll be talking through some of the issues raised in our latest course, Rethinking Disinformation, Psychology, Pre-bunking and Other Tactics to Halt the Spread. You can scan the barcode at the end, not now. Just let me introduce our panel today. At the far end, we've got John-Allan Namu. I'm sure some of you recognise him from panels already here. John's an investigative journalist and the co-founder and CEO of Africa Uncensored, a media house based out of Nairobi in Kenya. He's covered numerous elections across Africa and has himself been the target of disinformation. Next to me is Charlie Mayer. Charlie's the social media editor for Bellingcat and also trains journalists on using open source tools to help counter the spread of disinformation. And in the middle, we have Dr. John Ruzenbeek. John works at the University of Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab and also at King's College in London. John's an expert in understanding why people believe and share misinformation. And this is John's book. Here it is, just been published, The Psychology of Misinformation. You'll be pleased to know, John, it's a 5 stars from me. It would have been slightly awkward otherwise, but yeah. Well done. John, I want to actually start with you because in the nicest possible way, you are the odd one out here. Because we are all journalists, you're a psychologist, there might be some surprise we've got a psychologist discussing journalism. What can psychology offer journalism?
I guess to kind of turn that question around, first of all, before I actually address your question. What's often underestimated is what journalism can offer psychology, right? And journalists have a pretty good understanding of what is liked and shared and so on, right? But either through A/B testing or through decades of experience knowing what kinds of stories people like. And so psychologists have learned from that, right? And so they have done tons of research into what people are likely to share with each other, what people are likely to believe, whether it comes to true information or false information or anything in between. And so when you do that, you find a couple of things. Number one, this well-known idea in journalism that negativity goes viral. That's true. But it's not only negativity that goes viral. It's specifically negative language or negative speech about groups that you're not part of. So out-groups in psychology, right? So basically the idea is that if you are a Labour Party supporter and you talk about a Conservative Party supporter in the United Kingdom, or Republicans about Democrats and so on, and you say these people are terrible, they're ruining the country, etc., that, all else being equal, is quite likely to drive some kind of engagement, liking, retweeting, commenting, and so on. Compared to only sort of random negative speech about random negative events. So the role of group identity here plays a pretty important role.
You talked there a bit about why people believe stuff. We're going to come on to that in a bit. So we're talking about digital resilience. So I'm wondering if we're at the point now where, if you'd asked me even last year before I'd read your book, John, and other books around it, what I meant by digital resilience, I would have thought, oh, it's how OSINT works, it's how you fact check, it's how the tools work. Is it now, as well as that, about knowing how your audience works? How they behave and why they behave in the way they do?
Yes, certainly. And so that's where like psychology can play an important role in helping us understand what audiences respond to and to what extent that can take on problematic forms, right? Because it's not only us thinking about kind of the positive sides of virality and online content sharing and social media and all these things, but also about the negative sides. And so there's plenty of examples from Rwanda in the 1990s, for instance. It was a very well-known example of radio sort of playing a massive role in the spread of propaganda and hence a role in sort of exacerbating acts of violence. Psychology kind of tries to understand the role of group identity or social identity and in relation to the development of new media technologies and how that in turn affects online harms and even offline harms.
So there are some practical tips I know you've got to give journalists, which we will come to, but if we put all of that into some sort of context of what we're actually looking at now with the current situation. John-Allan on the end, if I can just bring you in, because you were at the Democratic Republic of the Congo elections back in December. You've covered many elections, not least the elections in Kenya in 2022. The UN said then that the country was engulfed in a tidal wave of information, was the phrase they used. You know, you're a veteran of many other elections. What is the scale of the current problem around disinformation as you see it?
I think in Kenya, in Africa, as well as everywhere, I think it's a major problem. It's such a problem. It's a problem that's so big that we need fairly big and audacious solutions to be able to counter it. But also, I think new thinking around how to be able to counter disinformation. One of the I guess the positives, for instance, if I can speak to that from the Kenyan election, was that we learned from elections past that not only are we a source for misinformation, disinformation, malinformation from inside Kenya, between competing parties, but when, you know, especially in the run-up to the 2017 election, not only are we a playground for that kind of misinformation between ourselves, amongst ourselves, but we're also a playground or a testing ground for new methods of the use of misinformation and disinformation that will be applied elsewhere. So, you know, the very infamous Cambridge Analytica, you know, scandal that took place in the global north, first was practiced in Kenya. Those tools and those methods were refined. And I think that's something that people often miss. As the digital divide becomes smaller and smaller in countries in the global south, and countries sometimes that have either weak laws or laws that aren't properly enforced, or institutions that are bent themselves on using disinformation for their own ends, then they also then become places where, you know, petri dishes where these things can be often refined. And to speak about the size of the problem today, almost every week, if you go online on Twitter or X, you will find one form of misinformation or the other, and especially.
And is generative AI making a big difference in that?
Well, not to a very large extent. I think right now it's fairly, at least in our example, it's not very prominent. What you find are networks that are rather manually assembled, but are very practiced in how they do these things, that are then coordinated around specific and have specific briefs. And oftentimes they will be very well funded, and therefore, you know, almost operate almost operate at the scale or with the effectiveness of generative AI around misinformation and disinformation. But you're starting to see a lot more of that as we progress.
Charlie, is it getting harder to tackle? Are you seeing things this year that you may not have seen before?
I think, as John just alluded to, I think AI has increased as a potential threat. I wouldn't say that it's at the scale that most of the journalists in this room may fear it is at this point. But it's definitely getting more difficult to decipher through the noise of social media, particularly as in different regions, different social platforms are more prevalent. For example, in Russia, you have lots of different social platforms that aren't potentially used anywhere else. So monitoring that becomes an excessive job just to monitor that one country in comparison
That's
to
interesting,
lots
isn't it?
of
Because
others.
we just talk about X, Twitter,
Exactly.
and actually there's lots of other platforms out there.
Lots of others. China as well is a good example of a region that has specific platforms that aren't used elsewhere as well. And research in those regions is a lot harder because of access restrictions as well to cover. But on the AI point, I think something that isn't talked about very often when it comes to AI is the risk of AI audio. AI imagery and AI video has been around for a little bit now, and there are tools and resources to help us cope with fact-checking on that. In terms of AI audio, there's hardly any tools sufficient enough to deal with the generative tools that have been made to create convincing audio copies. And just last year, a lot of people talk about US examples, but in Slovakia, we were contacted by a Slovakian journalist who was trying to find a method to check AI audio file, a deepfake audio, see if it was deepfake, that had emerged amongst the elections there. There was a recording of a senior journalist, somebody that everybody in the country was familiar with, and a senior politician who was running for election. And in the audio, they were discussing, in the local language, they were discussing basically influencing the election and rigging the results. But all of that information and all of the recording was completely deepfaked from interviews and things that they'd done previously. And when this Slovakian journalist came to us and asked us, is there any tools out there to help me decipher this? We couldn't provide many because it doesn't exist. And that's a big concern for me going forwards, is that a lot of people's understandings of the risks of AI has been very centered on the visual side and not so much centered on other means of AI deepfakery, like audio, for example.
So that's sort of the current situation, and just picking up on what John-Allan said earlier about maybe we are at the time when we need to come up with new ways of tackling this, which brings you back in, John, because psychologists, rather than relying on debunking, have been looking at this idea of a psychological vaccine. It's called inoculation theory, and it's actually called pre-bunking. Can you just explain how that works?
Yes, I can.
I appreciate I've just asked you something that you could write a thesis on, but you've got about
Yes,
5 minutes.
Absolutely. No, it should be all right. I'll do it by analogy, because the whole theory is based on an analogy to begin with. So how it basically works is the way that it would work in a courtroom, where, let's say, imagine you have a situation where someone's on trial for a particular kind of crime, right? And then you have the defense lawyer for the accused speaking up and saying, okay, the prosecution might argue that my client is guilty of this, 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 and this. Don't believe them, because that is false for this, 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 and this reason, right? So you're basically kind of preemptively debunking the arguments of the prosecution. So this is a very common tactic used by a lot of lawyers in the courtroom. And the idea behind pre-bunking or inoculation is roughly the same, right? You kind of try to predict what might go viral or what people might be exposed to in the future or near future, hopefully. And then you already kind of debunk it preemptively, because oftentimes these arguments or this kind of misinformation is recycled, particularly around elections, for instance, where you might see claims about election fraud kind of popping up over and over again. And so if you already kind of know that that's going to happen, then you can preemptively develop tools to render that kind of misinformation harmless. And that is, of course, really difficult to do, because you can't predict with perfect certainty what people will see, right? But you have a general idea, especially sort of if you've seen that kind of misinformation many times over. But if you don't have that kind of knowledge, then the next solution would be to not really look at individual examples of misinformation that people might be exposed to, but rather the underlying kind of tropes and strategies that are repeated over and over again in various kinds of misinformation. So to give an example, Russia loves whataboutism. And whataboutism is basically you were accused of doing something wrong, let's say you're bombing civilians in Ukraine, and then you say, well, yeah, but what about the Iraq war by the United States, right? Which also bad, right? Just because one thing was bad in the past doesn't mean that whatever's happening now isn't also bad, right? So it's a distraction in a way, a strategy to distract from the crimes that you're committing at the moment. But if you point out that that is a strategy that is often used in disinformation, you might hopefully at least get people to understand that this fallacy is at play, even in content that they've never seen before.
So just going back to how you choose the stories that you think might be out there in terms of disinformation, is it sort of a combination of social listening and using your common sense that, you know, so stolen election was a big theme of the 2020 election after Donald Trump lost the election. He says, well, it's been stolen. That sort of narrative we've seen repeated in other elections. So do you literally warn your audience, you might hear this on your timelines, this is why it's wrong, X, Y, and Z?
Yes, and of course, the better your sort of social listening tools and the better a grasp you have of what people are consuming and sharing with each other and what they are interested in, the easier it becomes for you to predict what people might see sort of a bit later on in the election cycle, for instance, right? So you definitely do need robust tools for monitoring what kinds of content go viral, so that you can better develop these kinds of materials, yes.
I know you've done a lot of work on this, and does it work, though?
It works in the realm of the kinds of effect sizes in the statistical sense that psychologists like. So
that's a very scientific answer.
Yes, for sure. So are the effects real? Sure. Are they large? No. But because that's the best way to counter misinformation is to prevent people from seeing it in the first place. But that runs into all sorts of really complicated questions around how algorithms work that recommend people certain kinds of content. What is misinformation, right? That decision, if you leave it up to a platform, let's say Facebook or something, that has ethical connotations, right? If you leave it up to a government, it's even worse. And so on and so on. Like, so in the abstract, that's the best thing to do. But in practice, you can't really do that always. So then these kinds of psychological or individual level solutions become more and more important.
I know your team, though, has done some work on this, and it has been effective. They've tested out certain strategies on the public with pre-bunking and gone back and seen how long it's lasted for. Because I was going to ask you, if we use the flu vaccine, I have a flu vaccine once a year because it wears off and there are new viruses out there. So how long does that sort of pre-bunking inoculation last for? Are journalists going to have to keep repeating the message?
Short answer, yes.
You can have a bit longer if you like.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I don't want to take too much time away from the others as well. So yes, so repeated messages always work better, right? The efficacy or influence of one-off exposure to anything is very low. And so the people who create propaganda and disinformation also know this, so they keep doing it over and over. They never only expose you to one thing only once, or at least they don't try to. And so it's the same here. You might need what you might call booster shots, right, of the psychological vaccine. The difficulty is administering them, right? Because as we know from the booster shots for the COVID vaccine, people were pretty happy to have the second shot, kind of happy to have the third shot, and by the fourth, they're like, I really don't think I need to keep doing this, right? A lot of people. So it's subject to diminishing returns. Same here. And so you need to ensure somehow that there remains a sort of an organic demand for what you're doing, right? If you develop a video that you run as an ad on YouTube, let's say, that people see as part of a media literacy program, say, then the video better be interesting, that's for sure, and useful, but also you need to be enticed to watch the next video as well, right? And if it's exactly the same video, how quickly do you get annoyed by any ad that you see? And in my case, it's really quickly. Right? So that's an innovation question that is not easy. Also because we scientists are by nature extremely boring, and so we have trouble sort of attracting audiences to begin with. So we need all the help we can get.
You've attracted an audience, James. Don't worry about it. So Charlie and John-Allan, I guess the question is for you as journalists, you know, is this going to work? John-Allan, because you said we need new ways of dealing with this. Is this complete woo-woo, or do you think actually this could work?
I think John's right to say that in theory this should work, and for the reason that the alternative, you know, puts you in a situation where you're looking at the ethical challenge of, if I take this information down, is it actually, you know, misinformation or disinformation? Does it need to reach certain people, and are we then harming the tenets of democracy and freedom of speech by then, you know, could that be an unintended consequence of trying to, attack misinformation in other ways? I think it's a combination of things. So, for instance, if you pre-bank, that's one good way of keeping a population at a certain level of education around how misinformation and disinformation works. Then you have to attack specific issues, perhaps through video, through radio, through the platforms that people engage with, through theater, through different formats that people engage with at various levels, and also through the use of technology. So I think it's as a phrase that you were using when we were speaking yesterday, a whole of society approach to being able to dissect and not just inoculate, but limit the impacts of misinformation. But I don't think that it's something that can just disappear off of the face of the earth. I don't think it ever will. And it's basically, and it is something I actually wanted to ask you, because one of the challenges that we have as journalists is that you will go out, you will seek the information, you find it, it's factual, etc., it's fact-checked, and you then present it to the public, and the public just rejects it, out of hand. I was in a panel, I was listening to a panel previously where they were talking about Donald Trump's tax returns and the amount of effort that the reporters in the States, went to get that factual information, fell completely flat. And if you look at him as an example, he just leaned into the disinformation and then further sort of like took many of his hardliner supporters away from this area where you have, credible, factual, fact-checked information, and created this, this divide. So I think it's multiple things that are going to work. I don't think it's one solution. I don't think we even know what the solutions next year are going to be.
No, because the technology is changing constantly for a start. Yeah. Charlie, what do you think? Because it strikes me as with debunking, I just wonder how long it's sustainable at this level for. Because do you wake up in the morning and sometimes feel you're playing whack-a-mole?
Yes. This is something that at Bellingcat we have spoken extensively about. I mean, we're often seen as an organization that is accurate in its reporting, but we get a ton of comments on a regular basis challenging some of our reporting and challenging the methods that we've used as well. Sometimes rightly so, sometimes not so much. But in terms of our approach, and something that we've realized and really focused on this year is education, and last year as well. We have realized that education is the way forward in terms of a multi-community approach, and we've realized that our audience is basically part of our newsroom. And built that as part of a community model. So we call it the Bellingcat onion. We have lots of different layers of community, and staff are very in the center, but we have lots of different touch points to all of these different communities that we work with.
When you say communities, what do you mean, universities?
Well, exactly, so researchers who perhaps work with us on a daily basis, to university outlets, to a general audience on Instagram, for example. And at each touch point, we've basically started to think about how we can improve media literacy and understanding of open source techniques, because basic open source techniques can be a basic stepping stone for people to immediately debunk something, or at least question something that they've seen. So part of that model, we've been working with the Student View in the UK, and we've been training secondary school teachers in media literacy and open source techniques, so that they can then teach that in school, because we believe that the younger generation, especially as they're coming up, if we can build resilience now, then this problem that's going to get bigger, despite efforts, is something that they could potentially tackle in the future. And with RFE, Europe Radio Free Liberty, we've partnered with them recently to create short videos for our Instagram audience and their TikTok audiences that show very basic tips and tricks on when to question media and how to very quickly find whether this particular media source is questionable or not. It's not fact-checking it, but it's planting that seed of doubt And this idea that you should treat everything you see online with a pinch of salt, even if it's from a reputable source that you previously have encountered. I mean,
Is there a danger with that? Sorry to interrupt. Is there a danger with that, though, that people don't believe anything they see or read?
I would rather them approach everything that they see and read with a question of doubt, so that they go and find further information on that, than just going online and accepting anything that's presented with them. Most people, what they do on social media, if they find something that agrees with their political or background bias, is they reshare it or like it, and then later on they might question it. And that's too late, because you've already passed on the information to somebody else, and it's already started to grow. And with a lot of the COVID misinformation, I'm sorry to bring it away from elections, but a lot of the COVID misinformation we saw, people were sharing things, and then later going, oh, actually, that doesn't quite make sense. And that's too late. The impact has already happened. And one of the things that we've seen also, which is quite worrying, is we've seen state actors and also disinformation networks start using the reputable news sources that we may all trust, like the BBC, for example, and using their branding and their graphics to create convincing disinformation strategies. At Bellingcat, we've been targeted by such a disinformation campaign where we found several videos online with BBC branding under the BBC report, with Bellingcat reporting, with videos of some of our researchers and our founder talking about something else, but the sound was muted. And in the text, it said claims about Ukrainian politicians and trying to sway public opinion. Obviously, all this investigative work was false, but they were using our name and the BBC name to bring credibility to the information that they were putting out there. And I know for a fact that other fact-checking organizations and organizations like ours that focus on investigation, open source, have also had similar experiences where our names are now being used to spread the disinformation further. And this is why I'm saying taking everything with a pinch of salt, taking everything to the point where we're almost having to now make the public trained on this stuff that journalists used to be okay to just refer to. Now the public need to know these basic skills. Otherwise, we're in a real situation as the disinformation, misinformation gets more sophisticated.
You mentioned there about impersonation, people pretending to be BBC News or whatever, and we are seeing a much more sophisticated approach to disinformation. So as it becomes harder, John, for journalists really to peel away the layers and try and debunk every layer, I'm not suggesting we all become armchair psychologists, but should we maybe be looking at the bigger picture and looking at why people believe this stuff, why people believe these conspiracy theories, as a way of starting to tackle it a different way? Why do people believe this stuff? Is there a simple answer?
Well, as an armchair psychologist myself, I can say with certainty that yes, there is a very simple answer. No. If only. Could you imagine that a psychologist would tell you that something is really simple? No, not exactly. Like, as always, it's a combination of factors, blah, 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 so I won't bore you with that story. But at the very least, you can say that there is a sort of a cognitive component, right, where it's sort of a general sort of ability to sort of think critically, let's put it that way, which can be trained, which is good. But then you have other things that are far less tangible than that seem to matter. So, for instance, what we find in studies in the United States and the United Kingdom, not elsewhere, weirdly, but in the United States and the United Kingdom, there is this concept that you can measure that is called actively open-minded thinking. And what that basically means is the willingness or readiness to check your own biases and assumptions. And there's a scale for that, and it turns out, and we don't really know why, if you administer that scale and then sort of measure how susceptible someone is to believing misinformation, you find that correlation is really strong, far stronger than with pretty much anything else that we've seen. And so that basically means that it's not necessarily an analytical thinking kind of deficit that we're observing, but rather almost a willingness to check your own biases that seems to matter quite a lot, which seems to be something that you could train reasonably, but I don't know of any trainings that do that. It's certainly none that work. We tried a couple of times, it doesn't really work. So that's a bit less tangible. And then the final thing that I think is really important to emphasize is the role of trust, right? Because this is, after all, a role of a sort of journalism event, right? A festival for journalists. And there is a lot of talk going on about trust in journalism and trust in the media, but also trust in science and trust in the government. And you might summarize that as institutional trust, kind of. And that plays a huge role, right? So how do we rebuild the trust that was lost, and sometimes was lost for very reasonable reasons, right? In the case of the New York Times, for instance, in 2016, which got the polls wrong on Donald Trump's chances of winning. Basically, I don't remember exactly, but there was one poll that said that Hillary Clinton had a 90-something% chance of defeating Donald Trump. And so that might have been, you know, what the numbers told them at the time, but it certainly didn't turn out to be true. And so that erodes trust, right? If you're like, well, the New York Times are telling me all this stuff and it clearly didn't pan out, then why should I believe them the next time they tell me something? And that effectively what that translates to is this saying from Dutch, which I'm from Holland. We have the saying which goes, trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. And that is definitely true, right? And so you're entering all these discussions about what trust means, but also how you can build it over time, but also prevent it from eroding when faced with challenges. In a time when there is more information than ever, it's pretty easy for an entity that sort of has it in for you, in the case of Bellingcat, this is extremely obvious, to try to chip away at that trust that people have in Bellingcat or other organizations. And sort of trying to prevent that from happening is an open kind of psychological question that I don't have an answer to at the moment.
John-Allan, we've spoken about this, haven't we? This sort of issue of trust and whether that breakdown of trust is driving people down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. What does it look like from where you are?
It's a reflection of what you're seeing across the globe. So I'll give an example, a quick example of the involuntary celibate culture that seems to be a challenge across the world. I mean, it's a challenge in Kenya as well. And what you see is because of the erosion of, for instance, you know, this question of trust and this question of leadership around who a man is, etc., for young men who find themselves leaderless or without role models or without direction or left, you know, to their own devices in large numbers. You find them then getting attracted into company that says that they are not the problem, actually society is. The same othering that John was talking about earlier. And that then now forces these people to believe their own biases, believe the hype of these individuals who seem to be speaking their language. And before you know that, then that goes offline and they start gathering in groups. They start, they start seeing themselves as a movement. And if you were to just take a step back and see what it's looked like across other, problems we've had, you see the same sort of, the same sort of trends replicate themselves with terrorism. So we've had very serious problems in Kenya and in East Africa and now along the coastline of East and Southern Africa with the same thing. What happened in Mozambique, for instance, over the past couple of years? The withdrawal of government, the withdrawal of institutions that people should have trust in, left space for Al-Shabaab, who had they absolutely had no presence there to be able to move in and completely destabilize the region. And now that's had very serious consequences years on. So these things have, perhaps different outcomes, but what I've observed, and perhaps anecdotally, is that the levers are the same. There is a withdrawal of certain groups of people from society because the pillars of trust that they used to believe in either have crumbled or no longer exist. And all you're seeing today is a replication of that online.
I know you've had the same sort of thing with far-right groups, Charlie, but for a journalist in a newsroom covering elections, struggling with all these sort of groups, far-right and whatever, digital resilience takes time, doesn't it? Debunking, pre-bunking takes time. So what's the solution to that? I mean, when we've spoken about collaboration, and I'm wondering if that is the way forward, really, to try and tackle this properly.
Yeah, so just quickly on the far right stuff, what we've been seeing, similar to what John-Allan was just saying, is particularly in Europe, neo-Nazis taking these kinds of tactics. I mean, we've covered Andrew Tate extensively as well, but that's a separate conversation. Neo-Nazi groups are setting up these clubs called active clubs, which are encouraging younger members to join through sailboating and doing fight nights and all these kind of activities that are physical and might be engaging to a certain group. And then once they're in, they might find out months later that it's, after they've been indoctrinated, that it's actually part of a larger Nazi network set up by an individual called Robert Rundo, who's currently facing federal charges in the US. So these kinds of patterns can be seen, and I think sometimes laying out those patterns to our audiences can be really useful. Again, providing our audience the tools and the means to check this themselves as well, and to report it to us as well as organizations. And then yes, as I mentioned in Bellingcat's case, we've been really thinking about collaborative efforts and putting our tools in places where it's needed. So for example, with the upcoming US elections, we're thinking about looking at partnering US universities with local newsrooms so that they can cover disinformation in localized elections at a local level, so that it doesn't necessarily look from a national perspective, but it's an easier target if you're setting up all these little local outfits and building this kind of resilience, building this education model, so that all of this disinformation doesn't spread to a national level and you can tackle it on a local level. So I think sometimes newsrooms can play that role in trying to work with community leaders, with education institutions, and working to try and build up the community in general's knowledge of the risk of disinformation and tactics to spot it and fact check it.
John-Allan, I Googled you before we came just to see who was having a pop at you this week. You're a man with 1 million followers on Twitter, which makes you a bit of a rock star in journalism terms. So it means you come in for a lot of stick. Yeah. But on the theme of collaboration, I mean, in all seriousness, is there some sort of idea of safety in numbers? If you work in a country where it's your government who's spreading disinformation, actually, if you collaborate, whether it's pre-bunking, debunking, that's possibly the way to do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely safety in numbers, but I think what has been more of a shield for myself and for other organizations in Kenya and elsewhere has been, credibility and openness. So admitting when you're wrong, if you are wrong, and standing with the facts when you are right, and not veering from them or trying to be dragged into, into side issues. I had, like very recently, a very, very difficult time trying to do that when a cabinet secretary, the equivalent of a minister in other countries, started to drag my name and our organization's name through the mud on the basis of a factual investigation that was based on science that we had put out that was challenging claims that he was making about a very, very serious issue in the country. Fortunately for us, the numbers were in our favor because I think largely because it was such an issue that was near and dear to many in the public, they took the science seriously. But had it been something that was a little bit more removed from the everyday experience, and I suspect that politics, bias, one's own subjective view of Kenyan society and journalism generally would have had a very, very different result for me and others. But this is something that, I try and insist to our journalists, but just generally as a good principle. The truth and facts must be the first shield of credibility that you have, and then creating narratives around the truth that you've exposed, around the facts that you've brought to light, then should be perhaps a second layer. Ultimately, when fighting misinformation and disinformation networks, there's a reluctance, and I think a credible one by journalists to sort of get into the arena and fight back, because then you're seen as subjective. But there have to be, and I don't have the answers here, but there has to be more thinking around what happens when institutions and organizations and professions that base their work on exposing truth and facts to the public are attacked, how then to respond. And that hopefully is something that John, can help us with, that, as well as members in the public. But I do think that there's an answer with what Bellingcat is doing, investing in the community of people who believe in your work, who follow your work, who consume your work on a daily basis, and not in a paternalistic sort of way. We're giving you these snippets of our work so that you can follow us. No, but actually having an open conversation and a running conversation with them. So I think that's possibly one of the areas that should be looked into to develop.
Well, let's get John to respond, because it's interesting you mentioned subjectivity around truth, because we do live in a time when people tend not to talk about the truth, but my truth, particularly around politics, and people don't like being told they're wrong. So, John, how should journalists respond? Should we engage with these people on social media who are spreading this nonsense and shut it down? How is the best? What's the best approach, do you think? Ignore it or engage?
Yeah, gosh. It's quite the responsibility you're laying on me here, just in case anyone is listening to this and thinking I should listen to this guy, John, and do what he says, which I don't recommend. Yeah, so should you engage with trolls? Probably not, right? And so if there's someone out there that's kind of lying about you or spreading lies, and you have an inkling that they might not be who they say they are, or it could be a bot, or it could be some organized campaign behind it, right? Then you don't engage with that, other than issuing sort of debunking or something like that in case that works. But then it is also true that not everyone is a disinformation agent, right? And not even everyone who's lying on the internet is a disinformation agent. There are definitely people out there who are misinformed in the sense, or uninformed perhaps. And in those cases, it isn't helpful at all to say, well, you're a Russian bot, go away, let's say, right? In those cases, kind of genuine engagement and making sure that people aren't put off by what might be seen as a standoffish attitude can definitely help.
I'm aware that time is ticking. Does anyone have any questions? This lady over there, we've got a microphone. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask about going back to the elections piece. They tend to be, not every election is America's, which is that it happens the whole time that America exists. The Canadian example is like we have few short weeks, and a piece of misinformation happens and circulates very quickly. By the time the journalists get to it and tackle it and get that information out factually, the news cycle has rather largely moved on. How do we account for those things? Like in a fast-moving election, how do you really deal with misinformation or disinformation?
I'm wondering, do you want to take that, John-Allan?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think there's a very complete way of being able to deal with misinformation in a fast-moving news environment. But what I think is starting to become standard practice is these kinds of coalitions of various actors who then look at different kinds of misinformation and can start to attack it from where they sit. So as an example, in Kenya in 2022, there was a coalition of various media actors, including newsrooms, influencers, etc., called the Fumbua Network, that then would start to deal with pieces of information as and when, because you're right, when pieces of misinformation come out, especially in a time that's as sensitive as an election, you can't rely on the one organization, the one journalistic organization that is also covering the news to be able to do that. But then secondly, as has been mentioned on this panel, it's really a question of, it's a longer term question that possibly will have better results if you start working today, which is education of the public, just be able to recognize misinformation and disinformation. So it's not a complete answer. It's not going to give you, it's not a silver bullet, but it certainly will help in being able to raise awareness about things that possibly could be misinformation, and then people start to pay less and less attention to these things.
I just wanted to add on to that. Sometimes with strategic disinformation strategies, if you track back the origin using open source tools, you can sometimes find actors or spaces. For example, a lot of misinformation is usually generated on different apps, different platforms, and then it might find its way onto X or on TikTok, for example. A lot of it we find when we trace back actually originates in closed messaging groups like Telegram, for example. If you can trace back the origin, sometimes you then have an account or a group to monitor and to watch. And if you're kind of shutting it down in the early stages like that, if you found kind of a repeat actor, then that can also help in fast-moving news situations. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, we want a gentleman here.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for your talks. My question was, with pre-bunking, right? Do you think there is the risk, or have you observed people that confronted with pre-bunking, they get paranoid and kind of think that the party promoting it has a dirty conscience? And I'm thinking about, like, for example, stolen elections. Have you seen that, or how would you tackle it if the answer is yes?
Is it okay if I
Yeah,
take
yeah,
this
yeah,
one?
you take this one, John. Yeah.
Meaning that, like, that it's a backfire effect, basically, that people become overly skeptical, let's say, of everything that they encounter. I mean, not really. It's a bit of a debate, I suppose. In my estimation, the risk of that is extremely low, mainly because these kinds of backfire effects, in sort of broadly described, are rarely observed in real life, if ever. But it also makes some sense, right? Like, it's unlikely, let's say, that you find I don't know, let's say video or something like that that says, okay, well, actually, this is how this kind of misinformation works, and this is how you can spot it. It's a bit of a weird reaction to then become paranoid after you've just watched a well-intended video and be like, okay, well, I guess there's demons everywhere. I should stop believing anything whatsoever, right? Like, it's just not really how people work, unless they were already inclined to do that anyway, in which case the pre-bunk or whatever it is still probably less impactful than the actual misinformation, right? And so not really something I'm all that worried about, let's put it that way.
We've got time, I think, for another quick question.
Hi, I'm Patricia. I work for Haripec Trust, and we do safety trainings. And I think my question is about safety for you too, as journalists, because you mentioned that misinformation can pose a threat for your own safety. So I wonder how you protect yourselves, and if you have any tips or any advice on how to protect yourself as a journalist from misinformation hurting your physical or digital safety. If you have any quick tips, thank you.
Do you want to go first? Yeah, I can go first. Okay. I think it's important for your organization to have good practices in this space. So, for example, if we're going to publish something, an investigation that's potentially risky or controversial, or we're expecting a bit of a backlash from state actors, for example, we warn the rest of the organization a week in advance, at least. That gives them the time to leave social media if they want to lock down their accounts if they want to, and just be aware that this might happen. We don't often see that it impacts the individual journalists because the organization's accounts take most of the brunt, to be honest. As someone who monitors those, I can tell you that. I think giving journalists that time to react ahead of a story coming out can be really useful. And then in terms of protecting yourself, as John was saying, in terms of engaging with these trolls, I find a lot of journalists often make the mistake of responding. As soon as you respond, you are giving visibility to the people that are giving you hate. It's increasing the visibility of their comments, and then other people will jump on, right? So if you're directly engaging with these trolls, they're going to keep coming at you, and it then becomes a campaign because you then become a target. And that's usually how people are targeted in these situations, and I think it's really important, if you want to put a statement out disproving a troll or put it out as a separate tweet or as a separate comment. Do not respond to the comment in the comment section. I think that's really a useful tip. And also keeping your DMs closed can be really useful in election periods.
John-Allan, have you got a quick comment?
Just quick risk assessment. And it is just to pick up on what she's saying. Just think about the likelihood of a certain event taking place as a result of your investigation, what its impact will be, and then plan what actions you will take. And so what that essentially gives you is time and a plan on how to respond. And these things are fairly easy to do, and they don't take a lot of time. And especially if you think that the kind of information that you have uncovered will have a certain kind of impact, it's always kind of good practice to do that. I think that's.
And I've got one very, very quick final question for John. Every newsroom has a lawyer. Does every newsroom now need a psychologist? Do we all need a John?
A lot of psychologists are unemployed, so probably yes.
Great, thanks very much. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much to my panel.